Chapter 91. Vicious Monsters and the Ever-Accompanying Danger. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. So, this is the Great Megwest Empire territory. Compass Carburetor muttered upon crossing the Burita Forest, landing atop a faraway hill as he took in the view. He turned around, noticing the pillars of Fectra collapse as they were no longer interested in killing them. It seemed like the fact of them never leaving their forest was indeed true, thankfully for him. Moreover, he noticed that there were no monsters around their vicinity. It seemed the fact of them being repeatedly eaten by the Fectra prevented any other monster from venturing into the region. Though, that also allowed Compass Carburetor and Duchess enough time and space to rest. They had expended a lot of Darlac already. And in response to the battles they would fight next, it was wise to replenish their Darlac reserves first. Use this time to familiarize yourself with the spy dragon. He pointed southwest, scout in this direction while I scout northwest. We'll move from one safe point to another and avoid battles as much as possible. He then sent his spy dragon flying in the respective direction, thinking, the capital, Mohart, is around 1,300 kilometers from here. This is a significant distance. Traveling by air would indeed be faster. But first, I have to make at least one another dungeon monster part of the secret society. That way, I'll have enough manpower to help me in the Mohart dungeon. Regreel is bound to obtain something that would shorten his journey. So, he'll probably travel this stretch of 1,300 kilometers within a week. He thought, sighing as he focused, sensing the areas that the spy dragon flew through, using its eyes to scout the place. In the meantime, he consumed some of the rations, replenishing his Darlac reserves slowly. An hour later, they began to move once again, flying through the air at a high altitude as they proceeded towards another hilltop. The Great Megwest Empire was a land of mountains and valleys. So, there were numerous hills along the way for them to use and get a clear view of their surroundings. What the heck is this monster? He frowned, spotting a monster similar to a tiger in appearance but with two heads instead. Moreover, its body was 5 times the size of tigers he had seen on Earth. That wasn't all, he soon spotted a herd of tiger monsters running as a pack as they targeted a group of serpentine monsters. These serpentine monsters were lizards with really long bodies, spanning around 5.6 meters each. On a general glance, the tiger monsters seemed stronger than the lizard monsters. But, the moment the two groups fought, they were evenly matched. While fighting, the tiger monsters breathed out a faint mist that began to corrode through the bodies of the lizard monsters. And in response, the lizard monsters bit onto the fur of the tiger monsters, causing the bitten area to turn to stone and then fall off like sand. Vicious. That was the only word he could think of, having zero intentions to confront them. After all, even if he won, if he was affected by their attacks, he was a goner. Moreover, there were zero benefits in risking his life to kill them. So, he simply decided to move away from the place. But, reality didn't go along with his thoughts. The Katia produced a lot of noise, grabbing the attention of some of the tiger monsters. As the humans in the air were tiny, not many were interested in hunting the prey that barely amounted to a snack. In response, the massive bodies of the lizard monsters were enough for them to eat to their fill and even have some excess left over. But 2 of them still chased after the duo in the air, following them on the ground. Compass Carburetor whispered, "How long can you maintain flight?" "Around 3 to 4 hours, I guess. I have yet to calculate the amount of Darlac I have in me. But based on the rate of consumption, this is a general estimate." Duchess replied. "Then, let's continue flying for an hour first." Compass Carburetor said, watching the 2 tiger monsters chase relentlessly without breaking any sweat. Until all the Darlac stored within the Darbal crystals growing on their foreheads was expended, they wouldn't become tired. So, the tiger monsters constantly kept pace. But after half an hour had passed in such a fashion, they stopped, for their territory had ended. And beyond that was the territory of another monster species. That finally left us. Compass Carburetor sighed in relief, soon frowning as noticed a vast lake span before them. And, swimming within it was a marine monster species with whale-like bodies. And, as the duo flew overhead, numerous shadows streamed within the waters before the heads of the marine monsters peeked out, one after another until the entire surface area of the lake was covered by them. The image alone was nauseating. Moreover, the act of the marine monsters opening and closing their mouths, revealing their grotesquely pulsating flesh almost caused him to vomit. As for Duchess, she was calm, stating after some observation as she smacked her lips, "They look delicious." "Seriously?" Compass Carburetor groaned, "Don't you feel like vomiting after seeing such a scene?" "Why?" she asked in return. "There's an unlimited amount of prey below. And, they seem pretty weak. I can easily kill 10 of them without suffering any damage. After all, they seem to be the product from a level 1 dungeon. And, no matter what they are, level 1 dungeon monsters pose no threat to me," she said, causing him to recall the fact that the one he was conversing with only looked human on the surface, but in actuality was part of a scarier race that loved to feast on the kidneys of humans. "Then, let's stop and set up camp here," Compass Carburetor said, noticing the entrance to a dungeon within a kilometer from the lake. "But, why are there no monsters around the dungeon entrance?" Duchess frowned, for based on her knowledge, when dungeon monsters poured out of the dungeon, they always camped around the entrance, guarding it. Even if a group of the dungeon monsters decided to travel farther in search of prey, their instincts prevented them from leaving their home, the dungeon they were born from, undefended. "This is strange indeed. Let's investigate it," Compass Carburetor said as Duchess slowly lowered their altitude. "This is, after all, the first dungeon we came across in the Great Megwest Empire. It would allow us to learn more about the truth of the incident that happened more than a century ago." Chapter 92. Duchess's Growth. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Grenston, the capital of Heroica Empire, two people casually conversed with one another, exchanging information about the general happenings of the capital and some interesting rumors they had heard about. Soon, they approached one of the largest buildings in the capital, the General Library. It was the place with information about practically everything. Strict records were maintained to ensure no information is ever tampered with or lost. In order to bolster the general knowledge of the citizens in the capital, the Heroica Empire allowed everyone to visit the library for free. Moreover, the library was situated right in front of the Royal Academy, bolstering the knowledge of the youth. As for any records deemed important, they were hidden away within the Royal Library. Concerning everything else, they were present in the General Library. The two men casually entered the library, stopping at the entry check to flash their identity certificates. As the guards checked their identities, they nodded as one of them pointed at a room beside. Any belongings would be confiscated. This is to prevent any malpractice within the library. Please understand the value of the knowledge contained within. We are aware. The two men habitually nodded as they entered the room beside, not showing even an ounce of emotional upheaval. Rather, they seemed to greatly respect the attention to care given by the soldiers. "They are really great men," one of the guards whispered once the two men entered the room. "You're right about that." Another guard nodded. "They are polite and value the information stored in this great library. Honestly, if only there were more of them these days." "Right," the first guard sighed, "even my own son mocks the knowledge in books and only thinks about increasing his Darlac reserves. Let's not talk about our children. We don't have to be depressed on such a great day." You are right about that. Back in my days, finished with their inspection, the two men finally walked into a massive lobby, eyes widened as they looked around at the pile of books everywhere, sighing in admiration. "I wish to live here." You're right about that. Such a treasure trove right in the heart of the city. And it's so sparsely crowded. They contained themselves, walking around as they browsed through the numerous sections, soon approaching a particular section as they pulled out books one after another. The two of them were silent, seemingly having not spoken a word to each other. But, they were constantly conversing through sign language. There's a massive lake to the west of Burita Forest. And, there is a dungeon located a kilometer away from it. Let's dig up all the information we can about them. Let's hurry. Lord Spirit doesn't like to waste time. Soon, they found some records from a century ago that indeed talked about the details relating to the lake. The two of them immediately prayed, transmitting the content to Duchess. Once that was done, they began to look into other information about the Great Megwest Empire, anything they could get their hands upon. Duchess was currently in her monster form, hearing all the reports while roasting a massive piece of meat on fire, drooling as she smelled the aroma. In contrast, seated near her was Compass Carburetor, appearing tiny in comparison. Upon seeing that the meat was done, he cut off a large enough piece and began to eat it slowly. As for Duchess, her head slithered in the air, making a curve as she arrived before the piece of meat, ripping off a massive piece before swallowing it whole. She similarly tore of another large piece, swallowing it after chewing it only twice. Within a couple of minutes, she had finished the piece of meat that weighed as much as 5 Compass Carburetors. But, it seemed she wasn't satiated yet, grinning as she looked at the lake over whose surface peeked out numerous monster heads, silently gazing her way. Her neck elongated to its limit as she bit onto a fish, shrinking her neck immediately as she yanked it out of the water. She raised it high up in the air, pausing at a height of 20 meters before dropping the massive fish, causing it to crash land on the ground. The impact elongated its body comically, causing all its bones to shatter from the force of the impact, killing it in the process. The head of Duchess flashed around a couple of times as she used her sharp teeth to skin the fish before expertly removing all the bones. She then lifted up the massive piece of meat using her neck and hoisted it above the flame, roasting it a bit before beginning to tear into it violently. Thank God I never foolishly tried to fight the Grogars. Compass Carburetor patted his chest, feeling his heart thump erratically as he watched Duchess casually yank out the terrifying fishes from the water and eat them like they were part of an all-you-can-eat-for-free buffet. Haven't you already eaten your fill? You'll have a hard time if you overeat. Compass Carburetor warned her. I discovered something interesting. Duchess smiled. When I assume my spirit form, my Grogar body remains within the symbol of secret society in me. And, my Darlak reserves in both the forms are connected. So, even if I overeat, as my body slowly digests them, my Darlak reserves would be gradually replenished. Duchess continued, as I'll be constantly expending my Darlak now, this is a good method to store up some excess reserves. Besides, having finished the second massive piece of meat, Duchess expended 100 Darlak to turn into her human-like appearance, saying as she wore her clothes, ever since I have digested those massive reserves of Darbal crystals you have dumped in my stomach, my digestive system seems to have been upgraded. Therefore, I'm able to digest anything I consume rapidly. My Darlak reserve is also growing at a faster pace now, even though it had stopped growing long ago. I feel like I would soon achieve strength on par with a level 2 dungeon monster. She laughed as they began to prepare to enter the nearby dungeon. Chapter 93. A decrepit dungeon. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Based on the records, this was a freshwater lake filled with plenty of marine creatures. And it was replenished by the numerous underground rivers at the place, acting as the thumping heart of this region's vitality. Duchess said as she looked around, noticing the sparse vegetation at the place, a sign of desertification, continuing, now, when I fished here, I tasted the water. It contains too many metallic minerals that inhibit plant growth. Is there no information about this marine creature? Compass Carburetor pointed at the large fishes peeking out of the lake's surface, trailing their gazes onto them, causing his hair to rise as goosebumps formed on his skin. From where did they come? How did the terrain of this place change so much? What, actually happened here? There is no information about that. Duchess shook her head. Everything my team is able to find is outdated information from a century ago. It hasn't been verified after that. As for the monsters we encountered, they are only active in this region and hasn't ever attacked the borders guarded by Heroica Empire. So, they have no information about the ones we encountered. Tell them to keep looking for any valuable information. Anything would help us at this point. Compass Carburetor loaded his gun, Hadora, checking to see that all 100 bullets had been loaded into it. He swapped the iron bullets with wood bullets, unwilling to waste the iron ones that he didn't have much of. Worn on his hands was a bracelet each. And strung on each bracelet using a thin chain was an armament. They were the armaments with 3 states. The remaining armaments were strung on his belt using chains attached to impression locks. This way, he can pull them out without trouble and not damage either the belt or the chain. Then they began to march towards the dungeon gate, cautious in their approach, arriving before it after 20 minutes had passed. Both of them made eye contact as Compass Carburetor mentioned, "Let's engage with any enemy using our ranged superiority. We'll first figure out their attack patterns and then proceed to attack through closed combat." "Fine by me," Duchess nodded as they gently passed through a misty film that acted as the dungeon gate. They arrived on the other side, frowning in surprise as they remained rooted to the spot, stunned from shock. After all, what lay before them was rubble, of human constructs, of skeletons that lay scattered all over the vast plains spanning past. Just, what happened here? Compass Carburetor was unable to make sense of the situation, failing to spot any dungeon monsters around. Everywhere he saw, there were only the signs of death and decay. Even the ground had a faint rotten stench, of a lack of vitality that had pervaded it for long. As the duo made eye contact, they sent out their respective spy dragons, intending to safely scout out the place first. Did a war happen here? Compass Carburetor frowned as he saw through the eyes of the spy dragon. Massive craters covered by smoke, cracks on the hills, polluted water, and stale air. It was like time had been frozen in the place ever since the incident had happened. After that, nothing seemed to have taken place in the dungeon. After looking around for some time, the spy dragons returned as the duo were silent. "This place is a mess. I can't fathom what led to such extensive damage everywhere." Duchess sighed, "Based on the information I am receiving through telepathy, during their prime, the Great Megwest Empire was too strong. They had hundreds of transcendents, causing their power to be at the peak among all the great empires. So, for them to be eradicated to such a clean extent, the disaster should have been beyond what was written in that scroll." Indeed, Compass Carburetor said, based on that scroll, Parlet and Grister were both transcendents. And they died horrible deaths after visiting the Great Megwest Empire. So, something should have been the cause. As Duchess nodded, the two of them began to walk, hearing the crunching sounds of the bones as they stepped on them. There was a deathly silence in the place, for there wasn't even any wind. The thumping of their hearts was audible in their ears as they walked forward, continuing to move as they scouted with their spy dragons in advance. Soon, they arrived before a dilapidated building, one that seemed to have served as a base to rest and hunt the dungeon monsters, a hub to transport all the materials harvested from the dungeon. The door barely remained in place, sporting enough wear and tear that a single touch was all one needed to shatter it into fragments. Nodding once, Compass Carburetor gently used the Hadora to push the door, slightly parting it to the side as he peeked inside, hurling back in fear upon seeing a gaping skull staring straight at him. It was because the skull sported a sinistrous vibe, of suffering lightning strikes and being corroded by poison. And, this head, though seeming like it had belonged to a human, was almost as big as him. And, it had been positioned right behind the door. "Let's check it out." Compass Carburetor informed Duchess through telepathy, "Just in case, we'll converse like this from now on." "Yes." Duchess slowly entered through the entrance and swerved around the massive skull, noticing the skeletal body of the skull positioned farther away, slumped, leaning on the wall. The bones on its chest had crumbled to the floor, powdered. Whether it had become powder from an attack or erosion through time, it was unknown. Such a gigantic creature. Compass Carburetor sighed as they walked through the lobby, looking around to find any message or the likes. But, a long time had already passed. And, since it seemed like the place had witnessed an intense battle, everything in the area had been damaged beyond recognition during the century that spanned past. Compass Carburetor noticed quite a few places where it seemed like people had left their wills. But, they were simply incomprehensible as too much time had passed. But, why are there burn marks everywhere? Were the attacks made using fire? Generally, fire is pretty useless since it can be easily guarded against using an energy blade. As for dungeon monsters, most of them have tough skins, so they would be able to grab hold of their prey before the fire began to damage them. If the fire is something like an oil fire, then it won't be possible to survive as you claim. Compass Carburetor said, inspecting the traces on the ground, but I can't determine whether the damage was from an oil fire or not. Chapter 94. The 3 MegWest Pearls. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. There's nothing here, no armaments, and no puppets. Compass Carburetor frowned, seriously, what had happened here? Upon failing to find anything of value even after scouring through the entire building, the duo exited it and proceeded deeper into the dungeon. Suddenly, while they were traveling, Duchess frowned, relaying a piece of news. This is a level 3 dungeon. And it was called a state dungeon since all the monsters here had been eradicated centuries ago. So, it was fully occupied by humans. Then, what was with that massive skeleton? Compass Carburetor frowned, and, why haven't we come across any other buildings? Lord Spirit, aren't we wasting a lot of time? Shouldn't we hurry towards Mohart Dungeon and prepare our scheme first? Duchess said, stopping, there is nothing here from what we have witnessed till now. Yes, but, Compass Carburetor said after some thought, I feel like we would figure out something important here. This is after all a major settlement for humans based on what was recorded. And see the state of things around you. Something has definitely happened here. I feel like this secret might help us later. He spoke. But, based on the records, this is a peak level 3 dungeon with a radius of 150 kilometers. And there are 3 floors of such a massive area. We can't afford to travel such a massive distance and make a round trip. It would take us many days to do so. And, we don't have enough provisions to last us that long if we were to use the Katia. She made a long retort. The distance is indeed worrisome. Compass Carburetor frowned, thinking as he said, are there any flying monsters in this region? Let me ask, Duchess said, immediately contacting the team present within the Heroica Empire's General Library. Half an hour later, she replied, there's only one. And that's in one of the 3 MegWest Pearls. MegWest Pearls, they were what the 3 level 5 dungeons of the Great MegWest Empire were called. Normally, as long as an empire was capable of maintaining itself while raiding a level 5 dungeon, they would grow in strength and eventually attain the status as a great empire. But, the Great MegWest Empire had 3 level 5 dungeons. And, they had been around for more than a couple of millennia without collapsing, displaying their sheer prowess and stability. And, these 3 level 5 dungeons were the beating hearts that vigored this great empire. After all, the radius of a level 5 dungeon ranged from 700.1200 kilometers. And, there were 5 such floors. A single level 5 dungeon spanned more area than the entire Great MegWest Empire. So, it could be seen as to the quantity of resources it contained. The Great Empire also had numerous other dungeons that they raided and occupied. As for any dungeons level 3 and below, all the dungeon monsters within had been eradicated. And, they were converted into settlements for the people to live. This way, the Empire's population grew exponentially, having a tremendous area to their reserve. Moreover, level 4 dungeons and above provided them all the resources needed to function their great empire. And, there was one difference between a level 3 and a level 4 dungeon. It originated from its dungeon boss. All the dungeon monsters, the dungeon boss included, grew a Darbal crystal on their forehead that stored all their Darlak within. Weak dungeon monsters didn't have a Darbal crystal on their foreheads. But any monster with a bit of power grew at least a tiny Darbal fragment. But, this Darbal fragment only acted as a reserve of stamina. No dungeon monster, dungeon boss included, possessed any special power that was able to harness this reserve of Darlak for any other purpose than to act as their stamina reserve. But at a level 4 dungeon, the strongest of the dungeon monsters reached a special state of being, attaining explosive power. Transcendence. Upon attaining this state, they were able to use one form of energy blade freely using their own bodies, just like the warriors among humans that managed to achieve transcendence. Normally, dungeon monsters were troublesome thanks to their tough bodies and their enormous Darlak reserves. Adding on to the ability to generate an energy blade, their danger level exploded exponentially. Honestly, after obtaining so much information, Compass Carburetor muttered in surprise, "How does the general library contain information related to transcendence? I thought everything related to that stage of being was treated as top-secret." "It seemed to have been kept there by mistake," Duchess said. "The book containing it was old and its pages were almost on the verge of crumbling into dust with touch. There are no signs of human contact on it for decades. As the general library is ginormous, there are such secrets that are lying about in it, just waiting to be discovered. As many generations exchanged ownership of power and authority, some information was bound to be lost." Compass Carburetor nodded, and it seemed these books have slipped through the net during such times. There could have been countless reasons for such a thing to happen. If he had to list, he could list at least a dozen reasons. But in the end, he didn't bother with that, digesting the information he had obtained. Anyway, if we wish to find a flying monster, the second Pearl Dungeon is our objective. But, it's situated only 100 kilometers away from Mohart Dungeon. Duchess sighed, "What shall we do now?" Among the 3 pearls, the first was Mohart Dungeon and the most terrifying of all level 5 dungeons. It was inferior only to the level 5 dungeon said to be the birthplace of the legendary spirits. The second pearl was Cuvert Dungeon and was full of cliffs within. Flying type monsters were dominant in this dungeon. Compass Carburetor calculated, sighing in the end as he said, "If we have a flying type monster as a member, our life becomes easier. We would be able to scout throughout the place without any time constraints. That would also reduce our journey time. Let's head towards the Cuvert Dungeon first," Compass Carburetor said as they began to retreat. "We'll fly towards it as quickly as we can using Arcadia." Chapter 95. Hagen, you are listening at NovelFull.audio. Mohart Dungeon, at its deepest level, was an iron castle, sporting walls that were at least 3 meters thick. It was a humongous structure spanning a height of 600 meters, a castle that was akin to a mountain. Currently seated on a massive throne in the throne room was a humanoid creature. The throne was made from Darbal, spanning a width of 3 meters and a height of 4 meters. And similarly to occupy such a massive throne was the humanoid creature, sporting a body covered with tough, chitin armor. The chitin armor was both ridiculously tough and consisted of numerous layers with mild elastic properties, allowing it to move without any hindrance. Growing out of its elbows were bone spikes, each a meter in length. A similar bone spine grew out of its forearm, spanning 2 meters in length, looking sharp. Its claws were also sharp, menacing even. And considering its size of 5 meters and its tough appearance, it was a being of power. Mohart Dungeon, Dungeon Boss. Currently, it was crying, shedding tears as it looked at a tiny Darbal horn in its hand. "My son, why did you have to forsake your life? Wasn't living a long life the goal that we strive towards? Why did you come to long for your weak life as a human? Why? Why? Suddenly, it lost control of itself, being overcome with a maniacal rage as it thrashed about, punching everything around itself before letting out a tremendously loud roar, causing the walls of the palace to faintly tremble. After thrashing about for a couple of hours, it slowly regained clarity of mind, slumping on the throne as it was mentally exhausted, massaging its head as it muttered, "This is becoming more and more frequent these days. I'm losing my humanity and becoming more and more into a Hagen. Most of my comrades have already lost their intelligence and have become nothing more than a Hagen now." Hagen. It was the infamous dungeon monster of the Mohart dungeon, to date the monster said to possess the greatest might. It was unknown how strong they were in comparison to spirits that were part of the legends, but their might was unquestionable. A group of 1,000 Hagens were enough to almost destroy a kingdom overnight. They were a force of nature. It sighed, "Is this why you chose to commit suicide, son? Were you unable to endure your beastly urges anymore?" But still, it looked at the Darble horn on its palm, saying, "Your warble is here. As long as I implant it into a human, you'll return and be able to live as a human. If that's what you wish for, your father would grant it to you." It then shouted at the top of its voice, using its power as a dungeon boss, "Everyone that still maintains their human intelligence, come here." An hour after it had summoned everyone, there were the weak sounds of thumping as a Hagen walked in, kneeling on the ground as it spoke, "Your Majesty, did you summon me? Hecutra, why are you the only one to arrive? What about the rest?" The dungeon boss asked in anger as its voice thundered throughout the massive palace. "I'm the only one left among us with a clarity of mind. Everyone else had already become monsters a decade ago. Your son held out the longest among all of us. Since I have starved myself plenty recently, I'm still somewhat able to maintain my sanity. Though, I only have less than 3 hours per day of my sanity left." Hecutra replied. "Fine, you're still a transcendent. So, you'll do." The dungeon boss sighed, waving its hand as it commanded, "This is my final command as your great emperor. Capture and bring me a healthy human, as young as possible. I have my son's warble with me. So, I plan to revive him through it." Reviving as a human, Hecutra sighed, stating honestly, "I have thought about it many times too. But, even if I have to resist turning into a monster day by day, I am still unwilling to become a human. Has your warble been refined enough to accommodate a second reincarnation?" The dungeon boss asked in surprise. "Not yet, Your Majesty," Hecutra sighed, "I've been focusing on it all along. But, I'm still far from attaining that. If you have any regrets, focus on refining your warble once you return with a human. My son managed to do it long ago. So, he should be able to guide you accordingly." The dungeon boss said, grunting in pain as it seemed to be losing consciousness once again, hurriedly waving for Hecutra to leave. As Hecutra left, she heard the intense roar resounding throughout the palace, "It seems His Majesty doesn't even have as much time as me." She sighed, "It seems he barely has 30 minutes of sanity left per day in him. I should hurry and make him see his son at least once before he completely turns into a monster." She gazed at the sky, exiting the palace as she ran through the dungeon. "It really is a disaster. Our great empire has been falling from grace ever since that day. Once His Majesty loses his sanity, our great empire would have truly fallen from grace and our once vast civilization would eventually be passed on as a joke in history." She sprinted through the place using her humongous figure, blazing past at tremendous speeds. As for any Hagens that came in her way, whether knowingly or unknowingly, she simply swatted them aside, her prowess dwarfing everyone. Eventually, she exited the dungeon and headed east, rushing towards the Heroica Empire as it seemed the closest. This travel speed is passable. At this rate, we would reach our destination after 40 hours of continuous flight. Compass Carburetor said after obtaining a general estimate of their speed, which amounted to around 30 km per hour. If we add the breaks taken in between to replenish my Darlac reserves and rest my aching arms, it would take us a bit more than a week to reach Cuvert Dungeon. Duchess said, suddenly frowning as she closed her eyes, hearing the report as she said, "The tournament has ended. And, Regriel has obtained 3 more companions. One of them is related to the administration while the remaining two are fighters, tremendously strong that our scouts are unable to figure out their strengths. They'll begin to journey towards Mohart Dungeon in search of the treasure in a couple of weeks, or even sooner. Chapter 96. Hunting a Monster. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. We have to hurry, Compass Carburetor muttered, and, making a flying-type monster part of secret society takes higher priority now. Otherwise, we'll simply be unable to travel as quickly through the numerous levels of Mohart Dungeon, not to mention create any plans against Regreal. Lord Spirit, a lot of this plan relies on chance and coincidences. Are you sure it would work? Duchess asked in confusion. Even though you have taught me a lot in recent times, I am still unsure as to how you can believe you'll be able to defeat a system. Based on what you have said, they are too mysterious and overpowered. Currently, they were conversing through telepathy. And, since this telepathy functioned as a mode established through prayer, i.e. Duchess was praying to transmit her thoughts to Compass Carburetor while he bestowed upon her a reply. Due to this, even if they talked about a system, since he was the target of said prayers, the resulting mental energy streams would only end up with him. Though, if she used her mouth to talk, it meant her brain would think of Regreal, causing the generated mental energy stream to land on him, immediately alerting the slave harem system. That's why when they conversed about the systems, everything was through telepathy. As Compass Carburetor had shared some of the authority of secret society to her, Duchess was able to see the mental energy streams, thereby verifying that their current method was indeed foolproof. Only after that did they begin to converse freely about System and Compass Carburetor's plans to slay them. It's simple, Compass Carburetor said after a smile, there is just one guarantee in my plans. It's because a system has aimed for it. There is no better verification necessary than this. Since the slave harem system intends to head towards Mohart Dungeon, it means the treasure there is tremendously valuable. So, as long as we obtain it first, we'll be able to turn the tables on Regreal. Mental energy is the tool used by a system. Deprive them of all their mental energy, and they become helpless. So, the plan is to constantly force Regreal into a corner little by little and make the slave harem system shave off its mental energy reserve little by little to break him out of a pinch. He concluded. But, you have no idea as to how much mental energy it has, right? Not to mention the fact that you don't know how much mental energy it costs to buy any abilities through the trade network possessed by a system. Duchess retorted, I was talking about this inconsistency in your plan. There's too much unknown to factor here. Well, that's life. Compass Carburetor sighed, it's not guaranteed that everything would turn out your way. Most of the time, we have to dive into a situation with little to no information and plan accordingly as the situation deems fit. Let's rest here for the time being. My arms ache a lot. Duchess said after spotting a vacant hilltop, landing at the place only after scouting through the surroundings with the spy dragons first. Once she landed, Compass Carburetor jumped off from her back, stretching a little as he asked, how much Darlac do you have left in you? Barely enough for another hour of flight. Duchess said, we've been flying for 3 hours straight after all. If not for my overeating session before, we would have had to stop earlier on. As they rested and ate their rations, their Darlac reserves were slowly replenished. But, it wasn't enough for Duchess to fully replenish her reserves. After all, she needed a lot to fly for the next 3 hours. So, while she was resting, Compass Carburetor sent a spy dragon flying out to scout through the surroundings, noticing a strange monster species resting at the foot of the hill they were upon. It was pretty massive in size, looking similar to a boar in appearance, but with more than 5 tusks on both sides. The Darble crystal growing on its forehead was also sizable, spanning 10 centimeters in length. It was a considerably large monster. After inspecting it a bit, Compass Carburetor said, there's a monster at the foot of the hill. There's only one of it there. Let me hunt it. All right. Duchess nodded, intending to return to her Grogar form when Compass Carburetor motioned for her to remain seated. Rest here. I can handle this myself. Compass Carburetor said. But, you still need me to carry the monster's carcass, Duchess replied. It's fine, I'll lure it here first and then kill it. Compass Carburetor waved his hand, picking up his Hadora as he inspected it, noticing that it was loaded with 100 wooden bullets. He then slightly descended through the hillside, making himself visible by standing atop a boulder as he aimed at the sleeping monster, using his Anthozoa to shoot at it once. The bullet slammed right onto its eye, injuring it in the process, causing its eye to bleed. The monster snorted, getting up with a start as it glared at the direction from which the attack slammed into it, observing the figure of Compass Carburetor, charging towards him readily, scaling up the hill without losing much momentum. It's approaching pretty quickly, even though his heart thumped in tension. Compass Carburetor calmly retracted Anthozoa as he hoisted up the Hadora, pointing at the charging monster as he aimed at its other eye, unloading the bullets non-stop the moment it was in range, causing the monster to scream as it was blinded. Though, having seen the position Compass Carburetor was at, it continued to charge right at him, intending to ram him to death. But, the moment he blinded his opponent, he quickly tiptoed towards the side, waiting in patience as he dropped the Hadora and grabbed an armament on each hand, activating them the moment the monster ran past him. Long Sword. The two energy blades in the form of long swords expanded to 10 meters in length, piercing through the monster's sides, hacking the joints of its legs when Compass Carburetor expended even more Darlac, activating a second state atop it. Wide Sword. The energy blades piercing through the monster's legs expanded in breadth to 3 meters, severing most of the monster's legs as a result, stopping halfway through the bones. He hacked in the fraction of a second, deactivating both the energy blades as he picked up Hadora and ran towards its back, unloading all the bullets on its ass, targeting its nether region. In its momentum, the monster took another step forward after being hacked by his energy blade. Its body weight caused its damaged leg bones to crack, tumbling to the ground when intense pain assaulted it from behind, making it scream in pain. Chapter 97. Overpowered Opponent. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The monster screamed in pain, sliding on the ground due to its charging momentum. As its legs were incapacitated, it was unable to run ever again as Compass Carburetor approached its side, using the energy blade to slowly sever its neck. That wasn't too hard. He muttered, dusting his hand as he carried his Hadora and returned to their camp while Duchess assumed her Grogar form, picking up the monster corpse as she set up a bonfire to roast it. It seemed the Grogars also loved to roast their food as she did the same every time. Compass Carburetor took a sizable section of the meat to convert into rations while Duchess happily devoured through the rest. Finished with her meal, she said, assuming her human form, "This isn't enough to replenish my Darlac completely. But, we don't have time to waste. Let's get moving first and hunt for monsters in our next landing spot." "Alright, if you say so. But, you still need some time to convert the consumed food into Darlac. So, let me scout for a couple of minutes and see if there is any other monster around us," Compass Carburetor said, taking out his spy dragon, intending to send it flying when a massive mental energy stream landed on him, alarming him as he got up, yelling through telepathy, "Danger." Hecatra had been running non-stop all along once she exited the Mohart dungeon. Thanks to her Darlac reserve, she wasn't tired in the least. And, due to her massive stature and her dense, powerful physique, she was sprinting at a speed surpassing 100 kilometers an hour. Along the way, she came across a massive monster as she suddenly lost sanity, pouncing upon it as she killed it in a matter of seconds before proceeding to devour it. Once she finished eating the monster, she began to run in the same direction she had been running before, despite having lost sanity. After all, the command was from the dungeon boss. So, her instincts as a dungeon monster caused her to follow it through. If she still retained her consciousness, she would be able to think clearly and resist the orders a bit if necessary. But after losing sanity, she followed through with the orders blindly. As she blazed through one terrain after another, any monster that noticed her approach scurried away in fear. After all, their instincts screamed at them to flee and never come under the line of sight of the terrifying monster. A regular Hagen was already tremendously powerful that it was capable of killing a horde of monsters. Thanks to their tough bodies, they were capable of resisting the strongest of attacks. But that alone wouldn't have made them this terrifying. After all, there existed numerous dungeon monsters that possessed a terrifying physique. The Grogars were one of them. The reason the Hagens were terrifying apart from their peerless physiques was the inborn trait that allowed them to take on any extent of damage without flinching. Regeneration. By expending their Darlak reserves, a Hagen was capable of regenerating lost flesh, blood, and even bones. Adding this property onto their ridiculously tough bodies, they were unstoppable monsters. And, this was just a regular Hagen. Hecutra was even more terrifying. After all, she had reached the state of transcendence as a Hagen, capable of using an energy blade. So, the sheer presence she exuded caused numerous monsters to flee in fear. As for the monsters that were greatly perceptive of danger, they straight up fainted upon sensing the depth of her monstrous power. As she had lost sanity, she was running non-stop towards the east. And having been at it for more than 10 hours, Hecutra began to feel a bit hungry. And right at this time, she smelled the scent of roasted meat, one that was aromatic when compared to the smell of usual meat. Without any hesitation, she swerved towards the source, trailing it as she reached the foot of a hill, gazing at the two people seated at the top. The source of the roasted meat originated from there, causing her to drool as she expressed her hunger, blazing up the hill before landing near the duo. "It's a Hagen!" Compass Carburetor shouted in alarm, holding Anthozoa on his right and an armament on his left as he shot all 6 bullets right into the target's face, scowling when he barely made an injury. When compared to the massive stature of Hecutra that spanned 5 meters, the wound he inflicted using the tiny bullets wasn't anything worth noting about. When he garnered the Hagen's attention, Duchess took out her Hadora and loaded it with all 20 of their Darble bullets, immediately aiming at the Hagen's face to begin shooting. The Darble bullets packed a lot of power, piercing through Hecutra's face, getting lodged inside. But once the 20 rounds were expended, she noticed the enemy's face beginning to heal automatically, pushing out the bullets. The damage was insignificant compared to the opponent's size. Duchess shot with her Anthozoa on one hand and her Hadora on the other, emptying the 80 iron bullets loaded in the latter. Though, all the holes the bullets inflicted upon were only surface-level injuries, barely skin-deep. Long sword. Compass Carburetor activated his armament, piercing the Hagen with his energy blade when the impact slammed him backwards. After all, the Hagen remained unmoving in place while the energy blade barely penetrated her body. So, when it expanded in length, he was in return sent flying back. Hecutra looked at the two humans, recalling her mission given by the dungeon boss as her hands shone with a yellowish-white radiance, causing the duo to stare at her in shock. For, manipulating Darlak without any armament only meant one thing. Transcendence. A Hagen that had attained transcendence. Damn it. Compass Carburetor cursed as he tried to find an opening when his surroundings changed, replaced by a world of yellowish-white. Hecutra's energy blades were shaped just like her hands as they extended from her hand, grabbing hold of Compass Carburetor and Duchess, forming a cocoon around them. To avoid crushing them to their deaths, she only formed a loose cocoon big enough for them to remain within. Chapter 98. Hecutra, you are listening at novelfull.audio. It seems to want to capture us for some reason. Compass Carburetor shouted through telepathy, having sensed the emotions behind the mental energy stream Hecutra directed at him. I'll return to my original form and fight to the death against it. Lord Spirit, I'll create an opportunity for you to escape. Duchess shouted in return, hitting the insides of the energy blade wrapped around her to see that it was sturdy. If you do that, you'll be killed. Let us wait and see what happens. Compass Carburetor urged her, noticing that Duchess seemed unwilling to listen to his words. Her immense loyalty towards him caused her to pay heed to his safety with the topmost priority. If we are brought to somewhere with more Hagens, your death is guaranteed. I'm breaking out. She shouted, returning to her Grogar form as she exerted all her physical strength, bellowing a primal roar as her massive body destroyed the energy blade wrapped around her. Her head flashed towards a nearby rock, picking it up as she hurled it towards Hecatra with all her might, causing it to slam into the other party and send it tumbling back by 4.5 meters. Her neck then coiled around the arm of the energy blade whose hands were wrapped around Compass Carburetor, exerting strength to shatter it into pieces. She then grabbed hold of Compass Carburetor, intending to send him flying high up into the air. Lord Spirit, please take out your Katia while in the air and fly towards safety. I bid you farewell. But, right as she was about to hurl him towards the sky, Hecatra's two hands, condensed from energy blades, wrapped around them. One of them had expanded in size to grab hold of Duchess's body while the other wrapped around Compass Carburetor, using a couple of its fingers to choke the neck of Duchess. Hecatra regained sanity, recalling from memory the scene of Duchess transforming into her Grogar form from a human form, shocked as she retracted her energy blades, observing the eyes of Duchess to see that she maintained perfect clarity of mind. Moreover, she noticed that the horn on Duchess's forehead was only a regular darble horn possessed by every dungeon monster, it isn't a warble. Besides, how did her body morph from a human into a monster? Besides, her weight as a human was only as much as a regular human. But now, she's almost as heavy as me. How is this possible? She observed the look of fear on the faces of the two people before her, opening her mouth to speak, gazing at Duchess. How did you transform from a human into a dungeon monster? Upon hearing Hecatra speak the human tongue, both were shocked. The gears in his brain spun as Compass Carburetor connected all the dots, immediately asking, "Are you a citizen of the great Megwest Empire?" "Yes," Hecatra said while turning around to look at Compass Carburetor. Sensing the numerous emotional fluctuations in the mental energy stream trailing from her when she said it, Compass Carburetor thought hurriedly, saying, "There is an ability to turn dungeon monsters into humans." An ability. She was surprised for a moment, saying, "Tell me more about it. Can I know the reason you captured us in the first place?" Compass Carburetor asked, immediately regretting his decision as he hurriedly changed his tone, waving his hands in a fluster as he said, "If you wish to learn this ability, it is pretty simple. I can show you the method." "Show it then," Hecatra said casually, watching Compass Carburetor hurry towards the bag in his camp. He then returned with the symbol of secret society, presenting it to Hecatra. "If you pray towards this symbol and pledge a certain level of loyalty towards it, you'll obtain the ability to transform into a human automatically." "Is that how you gained it?" She gazed at Duchess, asking. Knowing what Compass Carburetor had planned, Duchess nodded, expending 100 Darlak as she turned back into a human, showing that she could freely switch states when necessary. For more than 10 seconds, Duchess and Hecatra made eye contact, staring at each other without subverting their gazes. If this is actually possible, it would prove a solution to our situation. It would allow His Majesty to regain his former glory. She thought, gently taking the symbol from Compass Carburetor as she looked at it. "I can experiment by using my life. Whether it is true or not, I'll come to know soon enough." She then placed the symbol before her, reverently bowing towards it as she proclaimed, "From henceforth, I, Hecatra, pledge my loyalty to you." She then stared at the symbol, experiencing no changes in her. Duchess interjected, "An oath won't work. Only when you actually feel loyalty towards it would you be bestowed with the ability. It works on a mysterious concept." "I see," Hecatra said after a moment of thought. "Will anything change once I become loyal towards this symbol?" "You'll become stronger," Duchess said with a boast. "I'm a level 1 dungeon boss." Level 1 dungeon boss. Hecatra was surprised, stating with a mild shock, "It would have made sense if you were a level 2 dungeon boss. This firms it." She thought, recalling her memories of the past few decades where her humanity was slowly slipping away as her colleagues, friends, and family slowly lost their selves, becoming a monster husk of their former selves. If they can become human once again while still maintaining their monster powers, it's what we had sought all along. It's worth the gamble. As she thought of it, her desire caused her heart to thump, moving her emotional fluctuations, her beliefs, and her disposition towards the symbol, slowly causing it to have meaning and importance in her mind. Compass Carburetor was observing the loyalty stream between them, watching the reddish stream slowly turn great as he was relieved, expending his mental energy reserves as he condensed the symbol of secret society, approaching Hecatrix casually. As she was aware that none of them were capable of harming her, she focused on the task of establishing her loyalty towards the symbol. And right at this time, Compass Carburetor placed the symbol on her, watching it sink into her body. As if she had been waiting for it earnestly all along, Hecatrix instinctively understood the concept at play as she felt a mysterious power well up from within her. She followed the notion, expending some Darlac as her body shone with a resplendent radiance, vanishing immediately. And in that place stood a humanoid woman in her early 40s, jubilant as she looked at her appearance, tearing up. Chapter 99. The Power of a Transcendent. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Hecatrix looked at her human hands, watching them tremble as she noticed the faint reddishness on the back, observing the nostalgic weak skin that she had possessed long ago, and felt the lack of strength in her body. She was tremendously weak now. But in contrast, it was like her mind that had been burning and being hammered in a forge all along had now cooled, allowing her to maintain a crystal-clear train of thought, able to think like how she had done back in the days. It was something basic that she had once been capable of but had been inhibited thanks to her monster instincts in the past few decades. It was like she had a cold and hadn't been able to breathe well. And now, that cold had cleared up, allowing her to appreciate what she had possessed before. And as she observed her figure, she could see faint wrinkles at places, looking no different from the time when she had been a human. And, as she thought about it, she could still feel her Darlac. Rather, her reserves hadn't diminished yet. She was still a transcendent. How is this possible? And right at this time, as she gazed at Compass Carburetor, she understood, bowing to express her gratitude. So, my lord is one of the spirits. Everything makes sense then. Please forgive my earlier transgression. It's fine. Compass Carburetor waved his hand, relaxing upon surviving potential death. He then noticed that Hecatrix's loyalty continued to climb erratically. Rather, the more she appreciated her clarity of mind, the greater she appreciated Compass Carburetor's help. And in turn, the more her loyalty towards him increased. Soon, her loyalty reached the 3 digits when Compass Carburetor asked, "Can you tell me more about the disaster of the Great Megwest Empire?" Right as he asked it, he regretted, for Hecatrix's increase in loyalty abruptly stopped before beginning to steadily decrease. He abruptly said, "Fine, forget it. If you don't wish to talk about it, then I won't press any further. Thank you for your understanding, Lord Spirit." Hecatrix bowed, "And please, there has never been a disaster. There has never been a disaster." He frowned, intending to ask immediately when he controlled himself. Hecatrix's reduction in loyalty stopped as it seemed to be ever slowly recovering. So, he planned to ask it later, once Hecatrix's loyalty towards him surpassed whatever inhibition or reason she held. He didn't wish to do anything that prevented an increase in loyalty. So, after some thought, he asked with mild hesitation, "Why were you planning to capture us?" Upon seeing that there wasn't any reduction in loyalty, he sighed in relief, watching Hecatrix bow as she said, "It was to obtain a human body for our great emperor's son." "What does that mean?" Compass Carburetor asked in return while his heart thumped, clearly understanding based on his experience in reading countless system novels. "It's here, Regriel's plot." Hecatrix hesitated for a moment before she looked at herself, sighing as she began to speak, "There is something called a warble. It is a treasure we created that operates similar to a Transcendence Darble Horn." A Transcendence Darble Horn. To avoid him expressing his ignorance every single time, Compass Carburetor nudged Duchess, causing her to ask on his behalf. Right as she asked, a horn grew from Hecatrix's forehead. Once a human attains transcendence, she grows a Darble Horn on their forehead. And the state of transcendence doesn't give any increase in the quantity of Darlac in your body. 1,000 Darlak, that's the limit contained in the human body. No matter what we do, we can never increase this reserve. Those below this limit are regular warriors and puppeteers. And those that attain this limit are called transcendents. Hecatra said. Then, why are they called transcendents? Duchess asked, expressing her curiosity. Since you are a dungeon monster, you wouldn't have known about it. Hecatra continued to talk. The reason transcendents are called as such is that they are no longer bound to an armament or puppet upon attaining this state of being. They can use their Darlak reserves as they wish. She caused her hand to emit a yellowish-white radiance, condensing a projection of her hand using her energy blade, extending it in size to grab a rock and crush it into powder. She then varied it in size as she deemed fit. This is my power as a warrior that reached transcendence. My energy blade is called the energy hand. I can condense a pair of hands using my Darlak and can use them as I deem fit. There is no state like in an armament. I can freely modify my energy hand as I want. And, after retracting her energy hand, she condensed the figure of a Hagen, energy blade form, beside her using her Darlak, and, this is my power as a puppeteer that reached transcendence. I can create a puppet of a Hagen to use freely. Though, there is no practical use in this power. After all, I can achieve anything I need using my energy hand itself. As this Hagen puppet is in essence still an energy blade, it doesn't have any weight. So, it cannot exhibit any force. Though, it is still useful in multitasking. She smiled, condensing 5 Hagen puppets around her. A puppeteer's limit is 5 puppets. And as a transcendent, I can control 5 of them, thanks to my talent. She then caused the Hagen puppets to shrink or enlarge. There are more uses to a puppet too, but I am more inclined to use my energy hand since it gets the job done the quickest. And, if I wish, I can still use a regular armament or puppet. Only when my Darble horn appears on my forehead is when I activate my powers as a transcendent. Incredible. Compass Carburetor was amazed, clearly understanding that Hecatra was holding back while trying to capture them before. After all, based on what she had said, she was also able to increase the strength of her energy blade. Meaning, Duchess wouldn't have been able to break out of her energy hand had she not underestimated them to be regular humans. We were just lucky. He sighed. Chapter 100. Please help us. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Hecatra pointed at her Darble horn, causing it to morph until it became compressed into a kite-shaped crystal, and this is a warble. There are a couple of uses in using this warble, the pinnacle creation of our great empire. She said with a hint of pride, usually when you become a transcendent, the ability you gain is based on the armament and puppet that you have used for the longest duration in your life. So, were you using a shield the longest, then you are stuck with a shield as your ability. That simply sucks, because the transcendent state allows you full reign over your ability. And, having a shield ability means you have lost all your potential attack power. A lot of transcendents in the past have despaired about obtaining a useless ability that simply caused them to underperform as compared to their potential. Hecatra sighed, after all, it's not like we have a guarantee in reaching transcendence, not to mention the time it takes to attain that state. When it arrives, it arrives. And, to train our Darlak reserves, we use simple armaments the most. So, our resulting transcendent ability is, pretty **TTY to be frank. And, that's where the warble arrives. She grinned, this would be fused into our Darble horn, allowing us to freely choose our transcendent ability. Thanks to this, every transcendent in our great Megwest Empire possessed abilities that perfectly suited them, allowing our might to exceed the might of great empires from multiple continents, combined. And, that's not all. She said, for transcendents that possessed some puppeteer talent, they can use the second function in the warble. Sporting a solemn tone, she proclaimed, they can remove the warble from their foreheads and plant it on anyone, whether human or dungeon monster. And, once they win the battle of the mind, they would inhabit the body of the respective human or dungeon monster. And, since all those possessing a warble were old, experienced veterans of war, they would always win, we used this to inhabit the bodies of Hagans. Hecutra said, with that, we obtained tremendous power. We created warble that even people who hadn't attained the level of transcendence could use. Using that, they inhabited the bodies of other dungeon monsters, also turning more powerful. What happened to your original bodies? Compass Carburetor asked. Without our souls, our original bodies were in a comatose state. And, they would remain as such unless we decide to return. She shook her head, but, none of us even cared about that, causing our bodies to shriven up eventually from hunger. With that, we attained a point of no return. After all, using our warble a second time to inhabit the body of someone else was insanely difficult. We have to first refine it to a certain extent. Hecutra sighed, and, even to this day, none of us managed to do that, except for one person, the great Emperor's son. It seems he managed to refine it long ago and had chosen to commit suicide. It was because he was unwilling to remain a Hagan any longer. Was he fed up with living life as a dungeon monster? Duchess asked. Yes, Hecutra nodded, her tone turning weaker as she spoke. It is because as time passed, the instinct of the Hagans began to conflict against our human instincts. And eventually, we began to become more and more like Hagans, mindless brute monsters that wished to break everything in their path. The Hagans barely had any intelligence, so we had chosen them to reside within. But over the years, we began to lose our comrades whose human selves were destroyed, causing them to return to being mindless Hagans once again. So, if we wished to escape such a fate, becoming human was the only way out. But, none of us wished to do that, intending to remain powerful even if it meant such a fate awaited us. She laughed. After all, we had already lived longer than our human lives had dictated. A Hagan's natural lifespan is around 300.400 years. Hecutra concluded, the reason I attacked Lord Spirit is because of our great Emperor's final command. It was to select a suitable human to implant the warble of the Emperor's son. This way, the Emperor's son would be able to walk the lands in his human form once again. I see, Compass Carburetor muttered, immediately thinking of something, a battle of the minds to dictate the body's ownership. It's the perfect cliché for a system host to obtain power. The slave harem system would give him a skill to strengthen his mind, allowing him to end up as a victor when this great emperor implants his son's warble into Regriel's forehead. He smiled. Can you tell me more about this battle of the mind? How was your experience regarding it? Yes, Hecutra nodded, recounting the entirety of her experience and everything else that she had heard from her colleagues. Once she told him everything, Compass Carburetor looked at her, his gaze boring into her eyes. Do you wish to bring back your comrades? Thanks to my power, your humanity would no longer slip away. I am grateful for your help. Hecutra bowed. As I have become a member of secret society, I realized that nothing else has changed in me. I am still Hecutra, a loyal citizen of the great Megwest Empire and our great Emperor's right hand. Indeed, Compass Carburetor laughed, your identity won't change, nor will your disposition. Joining the secret society only has benefits. There are no disadvantages. Please follow me, Lord Spirit, Hecutra said, returning to her Hagan form, noticing that she still maintained perfect clarity of mind. Moreover, the encroachment of the beast's instincts no longer happened in her, causing her to feel freedom for the first time in her life, feeling that what she had hoped to achieve had truly become reality today. Followed by a gentle bow, she prayed, transmitting her thoughts to Compass Carburetor, I'll lead you towards Mohart Dungeon. Please rescue my comrades. Please help our great Emperor. And please, revive our once stellar civilization.